applications team, and I wanted to introduce you to this video on working with wickwear or performance wear items and small lettering. Over here I have an example of three different performance wear shirts, and I wanted to address what I used on each one. Typically you have your choices of the three backings that many of you are already accustomed to. This first one here is called Weblon, and it's very lightweight, has kind of a meshy feel to it, but is very strong and involves you to cut away the backing when it's completed. The other one is the more common cutaway fabric or backing, and this allows you as well to give you more stability, but it's a little heavier and may involve using more of a spray adhesive to mount it to the fabric that you're working with. And then finally, the last one, which is probably the least likely one you'd use for performance wear items, is your tearaway, simply because it doesn't hold up as long, especially after washings, and it could irritate a person's skin. So this, out of the three backings that you're most commonly using, this is probably the least likely one that you will use. There's also a water-soluble one, but that one tends to get a little puckery on this type of fabric after a few washings. Now, I wanted to address those backings as well, because I used an example of each one on these three different performance shirts. This first one, you might notice around the edges there's some puckering and pulling, and that was really where I used the Weblon only, even one sheet of it. Gave it some support, but maybe not enough, because you have more of a heavier item here with your stitches. Whereas maybe if it's just simple lettering across it, that may be a suitable one. But you can use a combination of one sheet, the Weblon, one sheet, the cutaway, and you are able to get a more improved look. But in this case here, I used two sheets of the cutaway, and you could see when I did cutaway, there might be a little outline of like a little bulky surrounding of it. I try to cut it as close as possible, but because of the nature of the design, while it worked, some people don't like to have that kind of blocky or solid look to the shirt when it's done. Whereas on this particular shirt, I used the same two sheets of backing, but I was able to use like a spray adhesive, and it held up quite nicely because of the nature of the design, and because I didn't have to cut away as much as I did on this one, and it didn't give me as bulky a feel, because even with the combination of the two cutaways here, I could have also used 2 or 3 sheets of the Weblon as a combination with this as well, and it worked nicely. Another thing to keep in mind when you're working with these types of performance wear items, the needles and the threads that you use. I would typically say that you can get away with using a 7511 size ballpoint needle, even though some people use a sharp, but it tends to cut some of the fabric a little bit. I'd be more inclined to use the ballpoint needle. But you can go with a smaller size needle, like a 7010 or even a 65-9, where especially if you have like light or thin letters. Specifically here, when you're working with script letters, a larger needle would create a bigger hole, and that would close up letters like an E or an A, or even the opening in the 8 here, whereas you can get a better look at the black lettering here on this college logo, where the smaller needle helped. The other thing with the smaller needle is you want to use maybe a thinner thread. The most common one is used a 40 weight thread. You may want to use a 50 or 60 weight thread. That, even though it sounds like I'm going higher with the higher the number, the thinner the gauge of the thread. Whereas the lower the number, like a 30 weight thread, that gets thicker. So in this case, you might want to use a lighter gauge needle and a thinner thread, especially with like black and white lettering that you're working with. And coming back to this shirt right here, I did use a combination, like you're all familiar with the Under Armour logo. When this was done by factory, they used a combination of 2 pieces of the backing with one of the fusible web or Weblons. Whereas when this one was done, because of the nature or bulkiness of the design or how large it is, 2 sheets was sufficient of backing to give this more stability. But either way, when they were cut from the backings were removed, the shirts sewed out pretty nicely and laid pretty well off the rack. So I'll move these aside, and I wanted to discuss that when you're using these backings, a couple things you can do. Like I said, you could use a simple spray adhesive to spray that onto the backing. And then one little trick I use, because most of the time you'll have to pick up the shirt and kind of feed the backing in underneath. And some people have some difficulties with it not laying as flat, although it's not that difficult with enough practice. You can get it to lay flat like this, press it down so the adhesive will hold the shirt, and then you can introduce your hoop and place that in there. But in this case, another trick I can impart to you was you could turn the shirt inside out, spray that backing, and then you could lay it right down and smooth it out. So now when you reverse it back out, it's already adhered to the shirt, and it'll make it easier for you to slide the backing, or the hoop into underneath the shirt and work the rest of the way. You can use your conventional hoops. I would just make sure that you loosen up the thumb screw just a little bit. So the one mistake I see a lot of people doing is they'll keep this tight, and when they do push the frames together, they tend to stretch the material. And the thing that you don't want to do, that probably worked against me with the white shirt earlier, was I had a little tight. It stretched the garment out, which was fine looking at first, but then the nature of the fabric, once you unhoop it, it'll spring back, and that creates those puckers around the area. Another common hoop that you can use that might help you is the magnetic hoops, and they work equally well as the regular conventional thumb screw hoops, but they don't involve any kind of pressure or tension adjustment. And then you could just set this inside the shirt, put it together with your backing, and you'll be able to get it, whether you do it on a flat tabletop or the conventional hooping device that comes with a lot of these frames. So I look forward to seeing you in the future for any additional videos, and welcome to Emelco and future videos.